The Chinese authorities very definitely want growth to be comfortably over 6% this year, and reform essentially has been sacrificed on the altar of a decent growth number. So what we're seeing is policy stimulus really coming through in these numbers. I mean, if you look at the credit growth numbers in particular, they were stronger than expected. That's feeding through into housing demand. That's feeding through into construction. The good old-fashioned sources of demand powered by stimulus are really coming through. Is it sustainable? Well, it's sustainable for now, absolutely. It's sustainable for this year, maybe for next year. On a 5-year view, no. On a 5-year view, this is a bubble that is building. Trend growth in China is probably a lot closer to 5% than 6%. You can't persistently keep growth above trend without there being some adverse consequences in the longer term. But for this year, next year, I think this stays.
And then what happens? Talking about a crisis? What happens when the bubble pops? And what did you say, 2 years?
Well, I mean, this is the problem in trying to predict the peak of a market or when a bubble bursts. No economist ever wants to do that. We'll predict the event. We won't predict the timing. I would say that what we're going to end up with is a point where the credit growth is simply not sustainable. Now, right now, China can manage its credit growth very well because it's debt that it owes to itself. It's all internalized. And the banking system is controlled by the government, and the PBOC is controlled by the government, and the debt is all internal. So, you've got that degree of control now. At some point, the government, either through deregulation or because more of the debt starts to be owed externally, will lose control of that process. And at that point, I think the credit-fueled expansion comes to a very rapid, abrupt halt.
So that's China, Paul. If we touch as well quickly on Japan and Europe, I mean, how worrying is it that the policies enacted by the central banks aren't getting the traction that they're seeking? And of those two areas, which concerns you more?
Well, I mean, I think if we look at Japan and Europe, they are very different policy objectives. So the overwhelming policy objective of the European Central Bank, I would argue, is to increase bank lending. And that's quite clear because they signalled that they didn't mind a stronger euro with the March decision, because they included a TLTRO there, which is effectively a capital control which prevents the euro from weakening, but stimulates bank lending, or at least offsets the consequences of negative rates. And bank lending is rising in Europe. Not maybe in Italy, but it's rising in most of Europe. So they are getting traction, although I would argue that the policy was largely unnecessary. The bank lending is growing. The problem for Japan, I think, is that the Japanese authorities appeared to believe that if they went to negative rates, the same thing would happen as happened in Switzerland. But that's not right. Negative interest rates are not a monetary policy. They're a fiscal policy. They're a tax on banks. And so you can't translate one country's experience into another country. And it was never likely that the yen was going to weaken on a negative interest rate story. I think what's happened now, of course, is that with the weaker pay round, the Shunto pay round, we've got clear evidence that domestic demand in Japan is going to remain fairly lackluster, and that's now leading to another round of angst about what policy stimulus has to come through. Which is more troubling? Japan, I think, has the weaker growth outlook. The European growth outlook is actually not too weak at all, given the ongoing bank lending improvements and given intercompany credit improvements. Another big part of the story is intercompany credit, and given the fiscal stimulus. Japan, I think, is a more troubling picture, but it's an economy that has been, let's be honest, somewhat sidelined in the last 20 years. It's not terribly integrated into the rest of the world.